This is lesson 8 of the Synoptic Gospel series. Today we are looking at the first Gospel in our Bibles, that is the Gospel of Matthew. It is not written the first one, but it's set there, you can almost say, as an example, as the first group to be reached with the gospel were the Jews, and that is where this book is going to. It is trying to explain to the Jews, the Jewish converts, what and who and when Jesus was. And to do that, the gospel starts with a very ingenious system, well known to the Jewish people. Let's call it genealogy. So this is the genealogy, that's chapter 1 verse 1, of Jesus the Messiah, or Jesus the Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then you have a whole list of people being mentioned in chapter 1 verses 2 up to 16. And there we have, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus, there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, and from 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah, claiming that he fits in perfectly into what we call the Old Testament. Of course, that is not what the Jewish people would say. They would call it the Tanakh, and maybe that's a good word to use. But anyway, what I'm saying is that this is important to understand what we are going to, where we are going to, because we are now on a list looking at what we have. Remember, this is part of the course of the Synoptic Gospels, and you have to do certain things, and I'm not going to repeat that, but just giving it to you. And then remember, we are in a certain way, and we try to look at what the Bible means to us. Let me change. Let me see if I can change it here. No, I can't. Okay. Anyway, so we're looking at 4 words that are describing what we think of the Bible. It is inspired, the Word of God, inspired, God breathed it. That's inspiring. That's the word inspired, explained. It's revealed. This is the Word of God, the Word of the Lord, according to the Bible itself. It's authoritative. You can go to 1 Corinthians 15, and then it's living. Okay, and so we have these several words and explained with Bible texts. Let's go to the next one. Okay, remember we talked about the Synoptic Gospels now for 7 hours of classes. Just look at it. We have a number of things we have to go by. First of all, there's a close verbal agreement in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are different phrases and shared passages. Generally, common sequence of episodes. Most of Mark's passages are in Matthew, and much of Mark is also in Luke. Matthew and Luke share material not in Mark. Remember, we talked about that. That's the content of Jesus' teaching. There is material only in Matthew. There's material only in Luke. Matthew differences from Mark show that there's a coherence. Luke differences from Mark show that there's some coherences. Mark's Greek is the least polished. Matthew and Luke are longer than Mark. So we have a whole range of things we know of and we look at again and again, but that is important that you know the comparison of those several gospels. Let's go to the next one. So we are now at the book of Matthew. Remember, we just read it. Uh, Jesus introduced here as the son of David, the King David, of course. I mean, that king lived something like 100 years before Jesus. And so we have those 14 generations to the exile, 14 generations from the exile to the Christ. In generally spoken, we will look at it again in the outline. Some chapters are more important than others in a sense, of course. For example, chapters 5 to 7 are what we consider the constitution of the heavenly kingdom. And chapter 13 shows the appearances of the kingdom in various stages. 24 to 25 shows the reality of the kingdom, its conflict, its future, and the need to prepare and be watchful for the coming king. Let's go to the next thing. Who is the author? Well, let me explain why there is no author being mentioned. And you will understand, I'm sure you will understand immediately. You have to understand that. Most probably the area in where the gospel is written is, like I said, most probably Antioch, or Antioch in Syria, because there's also an Antioch up in Minor Asia. So you have a certain, a very specific area, and you have a number of Jews being part of that church, and to give that group of people a good understanding, someone is writing it to them, most probably one of the leadership, and that's the reason why there is no name on it. Somebody comes on a Sunday morning and says, I brought together material about Jesus Christ and I call it the gospel of Jesus Christ. Of course he didn't put his name on it, because everyone knew it was him. And most probably those things were repeated again and again with the other gospels, except of course the clues in the last of the four gospels in John. Matthew relies heavily on Mark. So why would a eyewitness rely on someone else's source? Well, let me explain this. John Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and Peter preached, and Mark made notes, and he wrote then the whole thing together as the Gospel of Mark, and that was known even to Matthew. So Matthew said, I don't have to rewrite what is already in existence. So he wrote this material, and he added material he knew of. Okay? So he had this material. That material was shared, some of the material was shared with, of course, with Mark, and some of the material was shared with Luke. And then the circle is, then we are full circle, because then we have everyone together, the three gospels together. So that is what, although Mark is not an apostle and Matthew is one, That is the reason why Matthew relied heavily on the existing material of who we call John Mark. The time of writing, some people say it is written after the year 70. Why do they say that? Well, they said because otherwise you get into problem or in trouble with the content of the gospel. But that's not true. No, it's not true. When the gospel is written, say in the 50s, that is 10 to 15 years later than the book of Mark, it's very well understandable. And why the 50s? Well, remember the whole thing, the 50s with the Antioch church and people leaving the Antioch church. Remember, Barnabas and Paul left the church in Acts 13. So we have a whole thing going on in this, and there's a number of, they needed a number of leaders, and so Matthew was available because he was not in the original Jerusalem church anymore. Now he's seemingly, he works in Antioch. Fine, okay, that's it. Okay, so we have a personal link, we have a person, we have an author, we have a time, we have a setting. So what do we need more? Well, we need to explain what it is, what the book is. The book is the genre of the book is a narrative, and it is divided into, let's say, 5 major parts. And let me give it to you. The first one is how citizens of the kingdom, how do they have to live, in chapters 5 to 7. How traveling disciples conduct themselves in their evangelistical journeys, in chapter 10. What parables did Jesus tell, chapter 13. What warning did Jesus give about not hindering entrance into the kingdom on and forgiveness, in chapters 18 to 20. How will human history end, chapters 24 to 25. So there's a whole range of materials available in the book, and it gives you a good idea. So we have the genre, we have the setting, and of course we have the themes. Themes is always difficult because there's a lot more into that, even with what you ask, with what I'm going to share. There's much more than that. So the portrait of Jesus. Jesus is the true Messiah, the Emmanuel, God incarnate. Number 2, a bridge between the Old and the New Testament. 3, salvation history, particularism and universalism. Matthew traces God's continuing work of salvation within Israel as particular, and then extended to all the peoples of the earth. That's universalism, but not in theological understanding as salvation universalism. Okay, and then you have a new community of faith, and then you have the churches built and maintained by Jesus' continuing presence. He promised to be there. And then you have the Great Commission to evangelize and mission the whole world. And then the 5 discourses we talked before. And then we have the background of Jesus. What is Jesus doing? What is Jesus saying? Jesus is actually saying, I am the Christ. I am the Messiah. And he's, during the whole book of Mark, you find that as a guiding principle. Matthew is explaining how Jesus fits in to this specific, particular ministry of someone who calls himself the Messiah. And one of the proofs, of course, is to have this wonderful deeds he's doing, namely the miracles of Christ. The outline of the book, you can find a lot of outlines, and I'm not going to go into every detail here because that will be a bit strange, in the sense that I will just repeat everything, and you can find it on page 40 and 41 of your manual. Let us now look at the Gospel of Matthew with the background of the synoptic Gospels. The Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, that is, you have to understand, we are talking about almost 3 centuries later than Jesus lived. Okay, so you have 125, 225, 325. That's almost 300 years later. Then something is decided. And so people today say, that's when the Bible is decided. Absolutely not. That council only said, not dictated, but approved the idea of what was part of the New Testament. They did not invent a list, because the whole of the New Testament was in existence already in the 1st century. And in the 1st century you have the church fathers who are quoting them. And so a lot of quotes are coming from, yes, you guess right, the book of Matthew. So that's what we have. The Gospel according to Matthew. It's clear, you can almost say it's absolutely clear, that Matthew had access to the book of Mark. And we cannot stress that enough, because you have this, and we will talk about again about the book of Mark in another class, another lesson, but please, so you have the book of Mark, and then you have the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew is the inflated, the fat version of the book of Mark. Matthew added a lot of things that are not in the book of Mark, but now he adds them so that the people will have a larger view. Almost 90% of the material of Mark is being reused, some people say plagiarized, by Matthew. Plagiarism is an invention. Is an invention by people. And plagiarism has nothing to do with the repetitions you find in the Bible. The repetitions you find in the Bible are necessary repetitions. People write down material that they think has to be in it. So now we have a gospel that is called the Gospel of Matthew. You know, the Gospel of Matthew is the only gospel that speaks about the church. Literally speaks about the church. Not just saying something may be added to. No, speaks about the church as church. The word itself is being used. So the Gospel of Matthew, accepted in the 4th century by the Council of Nicaea, but being proved already before the end of the 1st century by the Church Fathers. And you can almost say John, who was the last of the apostles living and the last one to write the Gospel, and he had material to all of the Gospels. He had access to all of the Gospels, material access, and so he would write only a little part extra. In the book of Matthew, the extra is more than just a little part. But yeah, he's building on the Markan Gospel, and he's building on the material he shares with the book of Luke. So the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they contain a lot of similarities, meaning they have the same source for many cases. For example, they all portray Jesus as a teacher. They all portray him speaking about spiritual things, about following God's will. He chooses 12 disciples. He's directing them, he's teaching, he tells parables, he uses short stories meant to teach. He's a miracle worker. He heals the sick. He fights Satan. He is the Son of God, a Son of Man. He performs ministrations both in Judea and in Galilee. The Last Supper, the betrayal of Judas, Peter and his problem with Jesus, and then you see Jesus dying at the cross and then being resurrected. So you have a number of things similar, but when you speak about the same person, of course you have similar things. Some people will say, okay, why did not everyone, all 4 of them, wrote about the birth of Christ? Well, somebody did, and another one did, and they already have 2 different stories in the sense that they are adding to each other. They are not conflicting, they are adding things. And the others, they don't need that. For example, if I would talk to you about Philip, the King of Belgium, or the Belgians, do you need to know where he was born? Do you need to know when he was born? No, not really. Maybe an interesting detail, but I don't have to do that. Although I can do it. I'm not going to do it. So that's because there's no specific need for it. Only when you need to know, I will tell you. Where was Macron, the president of France? Where was he born? When was he born? How many girlfriends did they have? I mean, all those things, they are important for a story, but they are not important for what they are now. I mean, they are leaders of different countries. When you talk about the different countries, you don't have to add all these details. Same thing with Jesus. Why do you have to repeat all these details? You don't have to. If you think it's important and it's part of your story, you put it in. If you don't think it's important, you don't put it in. That's how easy it is. Okay. So you have a whole range of things you can say, a whole range of things you cannot say. What Matthew is doing is saying, this Jesus, his ministry, his being Messiah, is built on what we know from the Old Testament. So a number of prophecies are being mentioned in the book of Matthew as a proof of Jesus being the Messiah. So that's what we have as proof as such. Remember, like I said, Matthew is saying things that others are not saying. For example, Mary was a girl in Bethlehem. When Jesus was born, King Herod was planning to kill him. And so God informed the young couple with the baby to flee to another country. So Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, they went to Africa, to Egypt. And from Africa he came back. From Egypt he came back. So what we have is, we have specifics. You can almost say details, but it's not just a detail because it's a detail. It's a detail because we consider it a detail. At that time, that was extremely important. And there is a clue about the Messiah coming from Africa. So when you have that hidden in the prophecy, you have to have that hidden in the history, and that is what happened. So that's why we have. So when they moved out from Bethlehem, they didn't go back to Nazareth. They went first to Egypt, later to come back to Israel, and specifically to Galilee, and more specifically to Nazareth, and they lived there. And so you have the family ties with the rest of the family of that family. And one of the ties is John the Baptist. He is a nephew or a cousin of Jesus. I'm not completely sure how to determine that, but there's a family link. And it is John the Baptist who is saying, there is someone coming after me. He's not being chased, but someone in time coming after me. And he is the one the Bible explains as the Messiah. It's even unclear for us when you read this material whether John the Baptist knew he was talking about Jesus. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We don't know. I mean, it's not explained, and it's nowhere explained. Okay, and then you have the Jesus himself. After he was baptized by John the Baptist, when when the dove came upon him, and you heard the voice of God speaking, and then from that moment on, Jesus starts his ministry, and he goes on and explains to the people there what to expect. And that's not easy, because what he is expecting is kind of, In some cases, people say the gospel, and especially Jesus, is more speaking about grace. But that's not what you hear in the book of Matthew. In Matthew, you hear a more strict person. Someone, you can almost say harsh. But you have to be, of course, very careful. But he's very specific. He even goes further than the law. The law says you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. He says, even if you go into your heart and you think about it, and you already committed the sin. So the sin is deeper, stronger. Okay. It goes further also in the sense of what he is saying. Okay, for example, insulting brothers is a sin. Failing to forgive is a sin. Committing adultery is a sin. Divorce is a sin. Swearing falsely is a sin. So you have a whole range of prescriptions. Not only what is sin, but also you have prescriptions for what is eternal life and how do you get eternal life. Of course, we all know the text in John 3:16, but that's not part of what we have here in the book of Matthew. Matthew has a different set of texts. They are as important as John 3:16, but they are not as well known, although some of the material is absolutely well known. For example, the Great Commission, the commandments of the commands. Jesus adds commands to what we have already in the Jewish nation. Yeah, the 10 commandments are there, and he adds, if you wish to be perfect, sell all your possessions and give your money to the poor. You can find it in chapter 19. So you have what is being described in the book itself as an important part of what we would say is today's theology. Like I said, the language in the book of Matthew is, the language is fluent in writing, but what he is saying sometimes sounds quite harsh. For example, Jesus says, you, and he looks at his disciples and says, you will be hated. Excuse me, why should I be hated? Well, just because you are a follower of me, you will be hated. They hate me and they hate you. So that's a typical way of looking at it. The overall theme of the book of Matthew, you can say it's almost like a battle. It's a battlefield where you have different skirmishes, different things happening, and it's always with the idea of there's a war going on. So the kingdom of God is born in a war zone. The kingdom is a battle, but our kingdom is a battle with not just with swords, but also with famine, with earthquakes, and of course with wars. Listen to the text in chapter 24. A man will go against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against a mother-in-law. One's foes will be part of his own household. That is not a happy thing. Okay, it's more or less, I don't like that. I wish that was not true, but it is true. It's a ongoing problem in the church today. And I know, because part of my family, of my own brothers and sisters in the flesh, they are not part of the Church of Jesus Christ right now. So there's a difficulty here, a difficulty we have to understand, a difficulty we have to go by. Okay. The Gospel of Matthew is also saying, for example, do not use violence. Why? Because if you're violent will come your way. Who goes by the sword will be killed by the sword. The Gospel itself, the text, will end. There's a crucifixion, there's a resurrection, and then there's a commission of the 11 apostles. Remember, Judas hanged himself, and the commission is go into all nations. So there's a difference here. You have people close to Jesus who had the best teacher, the best pastor, the best teachings, the best explanations, the best examples, and the wonderful miracles done in your face. And you can still sell. You can still sell the Messiah for money. You have to understand, this is not easy. Not easy for himself. He killed himself because he was overwhelmed with sorrow about it. And then later, how do you think these 11 disciples, the 11 apostles, would have reacted to it? Others say, well, this Jude was not really a good man. He was the one with the money. If they needed something like money or they needed help for their family, they had to go to Jude. Judas. Same name, by the way. And then Jesus sends them out. Okay. On one hand, you have Judas and the money. On the other hand, you have Jesus sending them out. So, what is the idea, the Christology idea of the book of Matthew? Jesus is the Emmanuel, but he's also the royal Messiah from the line of King David, doing miracles, proving his Messiah, and then with his name, Jesus, Yehoshua, and his title, the Emmanuel. So how do you combine all these things in Matthew to have what we call the Christology, an idea how and who this Christ is? Since Matthew is borrowing 90% of the material of Mark, their Christologies, Mark and Matthew's Christology, are very close to each other, you can almost say they are almost the same. They are very close. So you have a traditional resurrection Christology. You can almost say in the synoptics, and that's also part of Matthew. Again, the reason is this block of materials that are exactly the same. Remember, the book itself was written to a number of Jews who most probably lived in a Greek-speaking environment, and so you have Jews with a Greek background, and now you have Matthew, who is most probably a Jew with an Aramaic background, bringing material into a Greek-speaking audience. So he is happy that he can rely on already existing Greek material, namely, the material of Mark. So what he is doing, he probably wrote his first copy in Aramaic and then translated it into Greek. And then he used the material of Mark as a background. So instead of translating it, he was just borrowing. So that is how you have to look at it. And that's why people in the 2nd and the 3rd century said that Matthew was written first because they had an idea of this Aramaic version, but it was not the first version in Greek. So there's a difference in looking at who wrote what first. But what is clear, that is that his Christology is the idea of who Christ is, who the Messiah is, was actually completely the same as what Mark wrote. Remember, Mark was the translator of Peter. So it was the apostolic idea of the Christology. And I think they talked about each other, and they talked with each other for a long time. How do we explain what is happening? That's specifically between the time of Jesus' resurrection and the time of Pentecost. During that time, they sat together for almost 2 months, and they talked about it, and they influenced each other, all in Aramaic, and that's the reason why I think it's first written in Aramaic. Actually, it is said in the 2nd century that it was written first in Aramaic. We don't know whether that means that it was the first one to write a gospel. It's just the first one to write it in Aramaic. There's actually no copy available anymore. The only copies are the Greek copies. Okay, we have a number of texts. A number of texts speaking specifically about the Christship or the Christology of Jesus in the book of Matthew. Chapter 1, verse 16, who is called the Christ, who is called the Messiah. Chapter 2, verse 15, out of Egypt I called my son. Remember? Chapter 14:33, truly you are the Son of God. 16:27, the Son of Man with the angels. 25, in verse 32, judging as a shepherd. Okay, so now we have looked at almost all the details. We are not going to very far anymore because we only have a few more minutes, and I don't want to put more pressure on you than what is necessary that I think you have to know. Matthew is presenting Jesus as the Messianic King. King and Messiah at the same time. Son of the royal house of David. So he's proving that again and again. So there is a specific reason for it. And the only reason can be that he is actually saying this is a king we are talking about. And who needed a king? Well, most of all, the Jews. Did the Christians needed the king? Not really in the same sense as the Jews needed. So there's a lenience to where we find where it comes from. Jesus is not only the Messiah, but he's also the Son of David. So there's this potential. David the King. Okay, and not just a David the King. You can look it up. Let's see. In chapter 1, verse 6, and Jesse, the father of King David. So it's clear that we are talking about the specific King David, the most honored king in Judaism, even today. You know, Solomon may be the biggest and the most important king. Let's say economically, David is the most important king. When you go to Israel today, you will find a whole range of hotels. David Hotel, King David Hotel, the House of David Hotel, the House of David Church. Now, a whole range. Bookstores, supermarkets, churches, hotels, bridges, highways. And how many King Solomons do you have? Well, you have King Solomon's garden. Well, it goes back to the time of King Solomon. King Solomon Hotel? I assume there are, but I've not seen them. Of course, I have not visited the whole of Israel. That's another thing. But just to give you an idea, the difference of importance. David is the king. David is the one to look for. David is going to produce an heir. Actually, Solomon did not. It was through the son of King David, Nathan, similar name as the prophet, son of David, and through him there is the bloodline of David is passed down. So, who is called Christ? Yeah? The Jesus who is called Christ, or the Christ. So legally is part of the ancient royal house of, or the family of Israel. He is born a king, but laid in a manger, as we know. So to think about Jesus being the son of David, it is a repetition in the book of Matthew. Chapter 9, 17, 20, 30, 25, 22, 21, 9, chapter 2, verse 2. Again and again and again and again. So you can actually say very clearly that Matthew had this idea behind. And I think it's for us good to remember that this is really happening, not just to us today and not just to you, but to all of society, to all of humanity. There is a king in the line of David, and that king was presented by the book of Matthew.